Some wounds never heal, they just learn to live with the silence. Silas McGrath had been carrying his grief for so long, he'd forgotten what hope felt like, until a scrawny donkey showed up at his cabin door. The townspeople meant it as a joke, sending the old mountain man what they called his perfect match. Chester was stubborn, ornery, and nobody wanted him. But sometimes the things we don't ask for are exactly what we need. As Silas looked at this unwanted creature standing in the Montana snow, something shifted in his heart. Maybe it was how Chester's eyes held the same loneliness he felt every morning. Maybe it was how neither of them belonged anywhere else. Could this broken-down donkey become the companion that would teach an old man how to live again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Montana, peaks like a shroud, and Silas McGrath watched it from his cabin window with the same ritualistic precision he'd maintained for the past 3 years. Coffee first black, strong enough to wake the dead. Then the fire, built with kindling he'd split the evening before. After that, the careful inventory of his supplies, the checking of his traps, and the methodical preparation for another day of solitude. At 62, Silas had perfected the art of living alone. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he pulled on his worn leather boots, the same pair Martha had bought him for his birthday 7 years ago. Everything in the cabin spoke of her absence: the empty chair by the fireplace, the single plate on the rough-hewn table, the bed that seemed too wide and too cold, no matter how many quilts he piled on top. The cabin itself sat like a stubborn sentinel on the mountainside, its log walls chinked against the harsh Montana winters, its stone chimney sending a thin ribbon of smoke into the pale dawn sky. Silas had built it with his own hands 30 years ago, when Martha was still alive and their son Daniel was just a dream they whispered about in the darkness. Now it felt more like a monument to everything he'd lost than a home. He touched the chain around his neck, feeling the familiar weight of Martha's wedding ring against his chest. She'd worn it for 25 years before the fever took her, and he'd been wearing it for 3 years since. Some nights he forgot she was gone and reached for her across the bed. Other nights he remembered too clearly, and the silence threatened to swallow him whole. The ring was all he had left of her physical presence. Well, that and the recipe book she'd filled with her careful handwriting, the one that sat gathering dust on the kitchen shelf because cooking for one person felt like admitting defeat. Martha had believed in abundance, big meals, loud laughter, and a table that welcomed anyone who might wander up their mountain path. Now Silas ate beans from a can and called it supper. Outside, the first snow of October dusted the peaks with pristine white. Winter would come early this year. He could feel it in his bones, the way Martha used to predict weather by the ache in her hands. The thought should have sent him into his usual preparations, checking the woodpile, inventorying his preserved food, making sure his water source wouldn't freeze. Instead, he found himself thinking about the town 15 miles down the mountain, a place he visited exactly 4 times a year for supplies and nothing more. Pine Ridge wasn't much to look at: a main street lined with weathered storefronts, a saloon that served more coffee than whiskey these days, and a general store run by the Hendricks family. The people weren't much to look at either, at least not when they looked at him. To them, Silas McGrath was the crazy hermit who lived up the mountain, the man who'd let grief turn him mean and strange. They weren't entirely wrong. After Martha died, he'd stopped being polite, stopped making small talk about the weather or pretending to care about their harvests and their gossip. When young Tommy Walsh had offered to help him load supplies into his wagon last spring, Silas had growled at the boy like a wounded bear. When Mrs. Patterson had expressed sympathy for his loss 3 years too late, and dripping with false sweetness, he'd walked away without a word. The townspeople had decided he was unfriendly, antisocial, maybe even dangerous. They crossed the street when they saw him coming and hurried their children past his wagon. They whispered about the hermit who'd buried his wife and his heart in the same grave, who lived like a savage up on the mountain with only the wind for company. They weren't entirely wrong about that either. Silas poured himself a second cup of coffee and stepped onto his front porch. The planks creaked under his weight, a familiar sound that usually comforted him. This morning, it seemed to echo in the vast emptiness surrounding his cabin. 40 acres of pine and granite stretched in every direction, beautiful and utterly lonely. He owned it all, had papers to prove it, but some days it felt like the land owned him instead. He'd been a different man when he first came here. Younger, optimistic, full of plans for the future he and Martha would build together. They talked about children, about expanding the cabin, about growing old together watching sunsets from this very porch. Daniel had been born here, in the bedroom that now felt like a mausoleum. The boy had taken his first steps on these same worn planks, had learned to whistle by imitating the mountain birds that nested in the eaves. Diphtheria had taken Daniel when he was 8 years old. The same fever that would claim Martha 15 years later, as if the mountain demanded payment for every moment of happiness it had allowed them. After Daniel died, Martha had wanted to leave, to start fresh somewhere that didn't echo with their son's laughter. But Silas had refused. This was their home, he'd argued. This was where Daniel was buried, where his memory lived in every board and stone. Now he wondered if Martha had been right. Maybe they should have left when they still had each other. Maybe grief was easier to bear in unfamiliar places that didn't whisper reminders of better days. A movement at the edge of the clearing caught his attention. Something brown and ragged was picking its way through the underbrush, moving with the deliberate stubbornness of an animal that had traveled far and intended to go farther. Silas squinted against the morning light, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It was a donkey, a small, scruffy donkey with ribs showing through its patchy coat and a disposition that radiated pure determination. It picked its way across his yard like it owned the place, stopping occasionally to sniff at interesting smells or to fix Silas with a look that seemed almost human in its intelligence. Tied to the donkey's makeshift halter was a piece of paper, fluttering in the mountain breeze like a white flag of surrender. Silas climbed down from his porch with the slow movements of a man who'd learned not to trust unexpected visitors. The donkey watched him approach with dark, patient eyes that held no fear, only a weary acceptance that suggested this wasn't the first time he'd been passed from one unwilling owner to another. The note was written in crude letters on cheap paper, the kind the general store sold for a penny a sheet. It read, "Your perfect match. Maybe you two can keep each other company up there. Don't say Pine Ridge never did nothing for you." The Citizens Committee, Silas read it twice, then looked at the donkey, who was now investigating a pile of old lumber with the focused attention of a scholar examining ancient texts. The animal was thin but not starving, tired but not broken. Someone had cared for him recently, though not well. His hooves needed trimming, and there were old rope burns on his neck where a too-tight halter had rubbed the hair away. "So," Silas said to the donkey, his voice rusty from disuse, "they sent you up here as a joke." The donkey lifted his head and regarded Silas with what might have been amusement or contempt. It was hard to tell. The Citizens Committee. That would be Mayor Caldwell and his cronies, the same bunch who'd been trying to get Silas to sell his land for the past 2 years. They probably thought this was hilarious, sending the antisocial hermit an equally antisocial animal, two problems solving each other, as they'd no doubt see it. Silas crumpled the note and shoved it into his pocket. The donkey had moved on to investigating his woodpile, apparently judging it adequate for whatever mysterious donkey purposes required evaluation. There was something almost companionable about the animal's presence, something that made the vast silence of the mountain feel less oppressive. "Well," Silas said, not sure why he was talking to a donkey, but finding it easier than he'd expected. "I suppose you'll be wanting food and water before you move on." The donkey looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes and somehow managed to convey that moving on wasn't part of his immediate plans. Silas sighed and walked toward the well. He'd give the animal some water and maybe a handful of the oats he kept for the occasional deer. Then he'd figure out how to get him back down the mountain to whatever unfortunate soul was supposed to take responsibility for unwanted donkeys. But as he worked the pump handle and listened to the familiar squeak and splash of water filling his bucket, Silas found himself stealing glances at his unexpected visitor. The donkey had settled near the cabin steps, apparently having decided that this was as good a place as any to rest his travel-weary bones. For the first time in 3 years, Silas McGrath wasn't entirely alone on his mountain. The realization should have annoyed him. Instead, it stirred something in his chest that he'd almost forgotten how to recognize. It felt remarkably like hope. The donkey had no intention of leaving. Silas discovered this 3 hours later when he returned from checking his trap lines to find the animal still planted firmly beside his cabin steps, now chewing thoughtfully on what remained of his winter turnips. The root vegetables lay scattered across his yard like casualties of war, some half-eaten, others simply investigated and discarded. "Now see here," Silas said, his voice carrying the edge that had made townspeople cross streets to avoid him. "That's my food you're destroying." The donkey, he really needed to stop thinking of him as the donkey and start thinking of him as that damned donkey, lifted his head and regarded Silas with what could only be described as mild interest. A piece of turnip hung from his lower lip like a vegetative cigar. Silas had dealt with stubborn animals before. He'd broken horses that wanted to kill him and convinced mules to carry supplies up paths that would terrify a mountain goat. But this donkey possessed a particular brand of obstinacy that seemed almost philosophical in nature, as if he'd considered all possible options and decided that leaving simply wasn't among them. "Go on," Silas said, waving his arms in what he hoped was a threatening manner. "Get moving! Shoo!" The donkey blinked slowly, finished his turnip, and lay down. For the next 2 hours, Silas tried everything short of physical violence to convince his unwanted guest to move along. He banged pots and pans. He shouted. He even tried reasoning with the animal, explaining in carefully modulated tones that this was private property and that vagrancy laws probably applied to livestock as well as people. The donkey responded to these efforts by falling asleep. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the clearing, Silas found himself studying his uninvited companion with grudging curiosity. Up close, the animal was in worse shape than he'd initially thought. Beneath the patchy coat and stubborn exterior, Silas could see the telltale signs of recent hardship. The donkey's hip bones jutted sharply beneath loose skin, and there were fresh cuts on his legs that suggested a difficult journey through rough terrain. Someone had mistreated this animal before sending him up the mountain. The rope burns on his neck were deeper than Silas had first noticed, and there was a wariness in the donkey's eyes that spoke of kicks and harsh words, of being seen as a burden rather than a companion. It was a look Silas recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror often enough over the past 3 years. The revelation caught him off guard. Here he was, preparing to send away the first living thing that had sought him out since Martha's death. And for what? Because the townspeople had meant it as a joke? Because accepting their gift might suggest he was actually as lonely as they thought he was? The truth was, he was lonely. Lonelier than he'd ever admitted, even to himself. The silence that had once felt like peaceful solitude now pressed against him like a physical weight. He talked to Martha's memory and Daniel's ghost, but their voices had grown fainter with each passing season until some days he couldn't remember the sound of their laughter at all. The donkey stirred in his sleep, making a soft, snuffling sound that was remarkably comforting. When had Silas last heard another living creature breathe nearby? When had he last felt responsible for something other than his own stubborn survival? As if sensing the shift in Silas's thoughts, the donkey opened his eyes and struggled to his feet. For a moment, Silas thought the animal had finally decided to move on. Instead, the donkey limped toward the cabin steps, favoring his left front leg in a way that made Silas's chest tighten with unwelcome concern. "You're hurt," Silas said, the words coming out gentler than he'd intended. The donkey looked at him with those dark, patient eyes, and somehow managed to convey that yes, he was hurt, and yes, he was tired, and no, he still had no intention of going anywhere. Silas knelt beside the animal and carefully lifted the injured leg. The hoof was cracked and packed with stones, and there was swelling around the fetlock that suggested an old injury aggravated by recent travel. It would need cleaning and bandaging, maybe a poultice to draw out any infection. "Fool animal," Silas muttered, though his voice held no real irritation. "Probably walked 20 miles on this leg just to spite whoever was trying to get rid of you." The donkey whuffled softly, a sound that might have been agreement. Silas found himself remembering the last time he'd tended to an injured animal. Daniel had been 6 years old when he'd found a wounded hawk with a broken wing. The boy had cried and begged his father to help, and Silas had spent 2 weeks nursing the bird back to health, while Daniel watched with the intense focus that children bring to matters of life and death. "Will he fly again, Papa?" Daniel had asked every morning. "We'll see, son," Silas had answered. "Sometimes the best we can do is try." The hawk had eventually healed and flown away, and Daniel had been so proud of their success that he'd talked about becoming a veterinarian when he grew up. The boy had possessed Martha's gift for nurturing, her instinct to heal rather than harm. Silas pushed the memory away before it could take root and bloom into the kind of pain that left him breathless. But something of Daniel's compassion must have survived in him, because he found himself walking toward the cabin to gather supplies. The donkey watched him go, with what might have been gratitude. Cleaning the hoof was a messy, complicated process that required patience. Silas wasn't sure he possessed. The donkey stood remarkably still, as if he understood that this discomfort was temporary and necessary. When Silas finally finished and applied a makeshift bandage torn from one of Martha's old sheets, the animal nuzzled his shoulder with surprising gentleness. It was the first intentionally affectionate contact Silas had experienced in 3 years. The touch nearly undid him. For a moment, the careful walls he'd built around his grief threatened to crumble entirely. He found himself thinking about Daniel's small hands patting the injured hawk, about Martha's fingers gentle on his face during their last fevered nights together, about all the ways love had once moved through his life, like water through a stream, natural and necessary, and taken for granted until it was gone. "What am I going to call you?" Silas asked, his voice rough with emotions he wasn't ready to name. The donkey tilted his head, as if considering the question seriously. Silas studied the animal's earnest face and stubborn posture, the way he held himself with dignity despite his obvious hardships. There was something about him that reminded Silas of his son, not in appearance, but in spirit. Daniel had possessed the same quiet determination, the same refusal to give up, even when circumstances seemed impossible. Daniel Chester McGrath, that had been their boy's full name. Martha had chosen Chester after her grandfather, a man she described as stubborn as a mule, but loyal as the sunrise. "Chester," Silas said aloud, testing the name. "That's what I'll call you, Chester." The donkey Chester pricked his ears forward as if approving of the choice. As evening settled over the mountain, Silas found himself making preparations he hadn't planned. He cleared space in the lean-to where he stored his tools, spreading fresh hay on the ground for bedding. He filled a bucket with water and another with oats from his carefully hoarded winter supplies. He even rigged a simple windbreak from an old canvas tarp, remembering how Daniel had always worried about animals being cold. Chester watched these preparations with obvious satisfaction, apparently having reached the same conclusion Silas was slowly accepting. This arrangement was no longer temporary. Just until spring, Silas told himself as he settled the donkey for the night, just until your leg heals and the weather breaks. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were a lie. Chester had already claimed his place here, just as surely as grief had claimed Silas 3 years ago. The difference was that Chester's presence felt like the beginning of something, rather than the end. That night, for the first time since Martha's death, Silas fell asleep to the sound of another living creature breathing nearby. The cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a home. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. The routine began the next morning, with Chester's expectant bray echoing across the mountain silence. Silas woke to the unfamiliar sound and lay still for a moment, disoriented by the presence of another voice in his carefully ordered world. For 3 years, his mornings had begun with the sound of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of hawks. Now there was this demanding, insistent, and somehow comforting in its very persistence. Chester was standing by the lean-to when Silas emerged from the cabin, his injured leg held gingerly, but his posture radiating the kind of patient expectation that suggested he'd grown accustomed to regular meals and intended to continue receiving them. The bandage Silas had applied the night before was still in place, though it bore evidence of Chester's attempts to investigate his own medical care. "Morning to you too," Silas found himself saying, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He hadn't spoken a greeting aloud in longer than he cared to remember. Chester's ears swiveled forward at the sound of his voice, and the donkey took a careful step closer, clearly testing the boundaries of their new relationship. Silas had expected to wake up with regrets about his moment of weakness, ready to send the animal on his way with a clear conscience now that he'd provided basic medical care. Instead, he discovered that Chester's presence made the morning feel less empty, the silence less oppressive. The water bucket was empty, and Chester was eyeing the oat barrel with the focused intensity of a prospector examining promising ore. Silas refilled the water and measured out a careful portion of oats, conscious that his winter supplies would need to stretch further now. The practical concern should have irritated him, but instead it felt oddly satisfying to have someone else's needs to consider. "Can't have you eating me out of house and home," Silas told Chester as the donkey buried his nose in the oats. "We'll need to establish some ground rules if you're planning to stay." Chester lifted his head long enough to fix Silas with a look that clearly indicated he had no intention of following any rules he hadn't helped establish himself. As the days settled into a new pattern, Silas discovered that caring for Chester required a level of communication he'd forgotten he possessed. The donkey had opinions about everything: where his food should be placed, which direction they should walk when Silas checked his trap lines, how much attention constituted an appropriate amount of daily interaction. Chester expressed these opinions through a complex system of ear positions, huffing sounds, and strategic positioning that Silas found himself learning to interpret with surprising accuracy. When Chester planted himself firmly in the middle of a path and refused to move, it usually meant he'd spotted something worth investigating. When he nudged Silas's shoulder with his nose, it was time for the daily hoof inspection and bandage change. The injured leg was healing well, though Chester had developed the theatrical habit of limping more pronounced when he wanted sympathy and walking normally when he thought Silas wasn't watching. It was a manipulation so transparent that Silas might have been annoyed if it hadn't reminded him so strongly of Daniel's childhood attempts to avoid chores by claiming mysterious ailments that miraculously disappeared when cookies were mentioned. "You're a fraud," Silas told Chester during one particularly dramatic display of wounded donkey stoicism. "That leg hasn't bothered you in days." Chester responded by limping even more pathetically, adding a small whimper for effect. Despite himself, Silas laughed. The sound surprised him so much that he actually looked around to see who had made it, as if laughter was something that could only come from someone else. It had been 3 years since he'd found anything genuinely amusing, and the realization that Chester had somehow coaxed that response from him was both unsettling and oddly hopeful. The conversations began naturally, growing from practical necessity into something approaching companionship. Silas had always been a man who thought out loud when he worked, and Chester proved to be an excellent listener. The donkey would position himself nearby when Silas was splitting wood or repairing equipment, his ears forward and his attention focused, as if the details of cabin maintenance were endlessly fascinating. Need to check the roof before the heavy snows come. Silas found himself explaining as he climbed onto the cabin to inspect the shingles. Can't have leaks when the temperature drops. Learned that the hard way, my first winter up here. Chester stood below, occasionally offering a soft waffle that might have been agreement or encouragement. The stories came next, prompted by Chester's patient presence and the way silence no longer felt like sanctuary, but simply emptiness waiting to be filled. Silas told Chester about the early days on the mountain, when he and Martha had been young and foolish enough to think love could conquer anything, including Montana winters and the isolation that came with choosing to live so far from civilization. Martha wanted chickens, Silas said one afternoon, as they walked the perimeter of his property, checking fence lines and looking for winter damage. Said the eggs would be fresher and we could have roast chicken on Sundays. I built her a coop that first spring, spent weeks making it predator-proof. Chester walked beside him, matching his pace and listening with the kind of attention that invited confidences. Never did get those chickens. Martha got pregnant that summer, and morning sickness meant the smell of raw eggs made her queasy. By the time Daniel was born, we'd forgotten all about chickens. Had better things to occupy our time. The memory should have brought the familiar stab of loss, but somehow Chester's presence made it bearable. The donkey had a way of accepting Silas's stories without judgment, without the awkward sympathy that had made talking to other people feel like walking through a minefield. Mealtimes became less solitary affairs. Silas had grown accustomed to eating standing up, consuming whatever was easiest to prepare while thinking about the next task that needed completing. With Chester nearby, he found himself sitting on the front steps, taking time to actually taste his food, while the donkey munched contentedly on hay or investigated the fascinating variety of textures offered by fallen pine needles. Martha's recipe book caught his attention one evening as he searched for something more substantial than beans and hardtack. The leather cover was cracked with age, and many of the pages were stained with ingredients from ambitious meals that now seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. He'd avoided the book for 3 years, but Chester's presence somehow made the idea of real cooking seem less like an admission of loneliness and more like simple consideration for a friend. The stew he made that night was nothing fancy venison from his last successful hunt, root vegetables from his dwindling stores, herbs that Martha had grown in her kitchen garden and that still grew wild near the cabin. But the act of preparing it, of seasoning it with care and letting it simmer while Chester dozed nearby, felt like reclaiming something essential he'd forgotten he'd lost. When he sat down to eat, Silas realized he was hungrier than he'd been in months. The food tasted better too, as if Chester's companionship had somehow restored his ability to find pleasure in simple necessities. "Tomorrow we'll check the winter stores," he told Chester as they settled in for the night. "Need to make sure we have enough to get through the cold months." The casual use of "we" surprised him, but Chester seemed to take it as simple fact. The donkey had already made himself comfortable in the lean-to, apparently considering their partnership a settled matter that required no further discussion. For the first time in 3 years, Silas McGrath was making plans that extended beyond mere survival. Chester's intelligence revealed itself in unexpected ways. Within a week of his arrival, the donkey had figured out how to open the gate latch with his teeth, how to nudge the water pump handle just enough to get a drink without flooding the yard, and how to position himself strategically between Silas and whatever task the man was attempting to complete alone. It was this last skill that proved most revealing. Chester seemed to possess an uncanny ability to sense when Silas was struggling with something, hauling heavy logs, reaching high shelves, or wrestling with equipment that really required two sets of hands. The donkey would simply appear at exactly the right moment, offering his sturdy back as a brace or his considerable weight as an anchor point. "You're too smart for your own good," Silas told him after Chester had somehow intuited that the rope Silas was trying to secure needed to be held steady while he tied it off. "Probably smarter than half the people in Pine Ridge," Chester responded, with what Silas had learned to recognize as his smug expression, ears forward, eyes bright, chin lifted slightly, as if he were quite aware of his own cleverness and entirely pleased with it. The first real test of their partnership came when Silas decided to repair the chicken coop Martha had always wanted. The structure had been sitting empty for 15 years, slowly succumbing to weather and neglect. But something about Chester's presence made the idea of having other animals around seem less daunting and more like the natural progression of a working homestead. The project required carrying lumber from his supply shed to the coop site, a distance of about 50 yards across uneven ground. Silas had rigged a makeshift harness from rope and leather scraps, intending to use Chester as a pack animal for the Silas. Heavier boards. He'd expected resistance, maybe even outright rebellion. What he got instead was enthusiastic cooperation. Chester not only accepted the harness without complaint, but seemed to take genuine pride in his work. He positioned himself carefully when Silas loaded the boards, adjusted his stance to balance the weight properly, and walked with deliberate precision to avoid jostling his cargo. When they reached the coop site, he stood perfectly still while Silas unloaded, then looked back expectantly, as if asking what they should carry next. "You've done this before," Silas observed, running his hand along Chester's neck in appreciation. "Someone taught you to work." The praise seemed to matter to Chester. His ears pricked forward, and he leaned into Silas's touch with obvious pleasure. It was a response that spoke of careful training and positive reinforcement, of someone who had once taken the time to teach him properly. The realization made Silas wonder again about Chester's history, about the journey that had brought him to this mountain as an unwanted joke. By the end of the day, they had moved enough lumber to begin the actual repairs. Silas's back ached in ways it hadn't in years. Good aches, the kind that came from productive work, rather than the dull, persistent pain of loneliness. Chester seemed equally satisfied with their accomplishments, settling down near the work site, as if claiming his role as construction supervisor. "Tomorrow we'll start on the actual building," Silas said, gathering his tools as the sun began to set behind the peaks. "Need to replace the floorboards first, then work our way up." Chester waffled agreement and followed him back toward the cabin. The evening routine had evolved naturally into something that felt almost domestic. Silas would tend to Chester's needs, fresh water, hay, a quick check of the healing leg, while the donkey supervised the preparation of dinner with obvious interest. Chester had developed particular opinions about Silas's cooking, expressing approval for meals that included fresh vegetables and polite skepticism for anything that came from a can. It was during one of these evening preparations that Silas found himself laughing again, this time at Chester's obvious disdain for the beans Silas had opened for a quick supper. The donkey had actually turned his back on the meal and walked away with what could only be described as wounded dignity. "All right, Your Majesty," Silas said, still chuckling. "Let me see what else I can find." He rummaged through Martha's recipe book until he found her instructions for cornbread, something he could make with ingredients he had on hand. As he mixed the batter, he found himself humming a tune Martha used to sing while she worked in the kitchen. Something about wildflowers and mountain streams that had always made him smile. Chester returned when the cornbread was baking, apparently having forgiven Silas for the bean incident. He positioned himself near the stove, occasionally lifting his nose to sample the aroma with obvious approval. "You're going to spoil me," Silas told him. "Pretty soon, I'll be cooking 3-course meals just to see that satisfied look on your face." The truth was, he was enjoying the cooking almost as much as Chester enjoyed the results. There was something deeply satisfying about creating something good from simple ingredients, about taking the time to make meals that nourished rather than merely sustained. Martha had always said that cooking was an act of love, even when you were only cooking for yourself. Maybe especially when you were cooking for yourself. After dinner, they settled into what had become their evening routine. Silas would sit on the front steps with a cup of coffee, watching the last light fade from the peaks, while Chester dozed nearby. These quiet moments had become the most peaceful part of Silas's day, a time when the silence felt companionable rather than oppressive. "Used to sit here with Martha," he found himself saying one evening, the words coming easier than they had in years. "She'd bring her mending and I'd work on whatever needed fixing. Daniel would run around catching fireflies until it got too dark to see." Chester opened one eye and regarded Silas with sleepy attention. Martha always said this was her favorite time of day, called it the breathing space between work and rest, said it reminded her that we were exactly where we belonged. The memory brought the familiar tightness to his chest, but it was gentler now, more like nostalgia than raw grief. Chester's presence seemed to create a buffer between Silas and the worst of his pain, allowing him to remember the good parts without being overwhelmed by the loss. "Think she would have liked you?" Silas continued. "She always had a soft spot for stubborn creatures who needed someone to believe in them." Chester made a soft sound that might have been understanding or might have been simple contentment. Either way, it felt like agreement. As they prepared for bed, Silas realized he was looking forward to tomorrow in a way he hadn't in 3 years. There was work to be done, projects to complete, and for the first time since Martha's death, he had someone to share them with. The frayed rope halter he'd fashioned for Chester hung on a peg beside the cabin door, and Silas found himself studying it with satisfaction. It wasn't much to look at, just scraps of rope and leather cobbled together from materials he had on hand, but it represented something important. It was the first thing he'd made with someone else's comfort and safety in mind, the first step toward caring about something beyond his own solitary survival. Chester was no longer just an unwanted visitor or a temporary responsibility. He had become something Silas hadn't expected to find again, a reason to hope that tomorrow might be better than today. The first blizzard of winter arrived 2 weeks earlier than expected, sweeping down from the northern peaks with the kind of ferocity that reminded anyone foolish enough to live at altitude that mountains made their own rules about weather and survival. Silas woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin, like something alive and hungry, rattling the shutters and sending snow spiraling down the chimney to hiss against the fire. Chester was already awake when Silas stumbled outside to check on him, the donkey standing alert in his shelter with his ears swiveling to track the storm's intensity. The lean-to Silas had built for him was holding up well, but snow was driving sideways through any gap wider than a finger, and Chester's water had frozen solid despite the protection. "This is the real thing," Silas told him, having to raise his voice over the wind. "Could last 3 days, maybe longer." Chester looked at the swirling snow with what appeared to be professional interest rather than fear. Whatever hardships had brought him to this mountain, they'd apparently included experience with serious weather. The storm tested every aspect of their new partnership. Silas had prepared for winter as a solitary man, calculating his needs based on decades of experience living alone. Adding Chester to the equation meant recalculating everything: fuel consumption, food stores, water requirements, and the delicate balance between conservation and comfort that determined whether mountain winters were merely difficult or potentially deadly. Chester proved invaluable in ways Silas hadn't anticipated. The donkey's sure footing on ice and snow meant he could navigate conditions that would have left Silas struggling, and his ability to carry supplies became crucial when the storm made multiple trips to the woodshed. Both dangerous and exhausting. More importantly, Chester seemed to understand the seriousness of their situation and responded accordingly, working without his usual stubborn negotiations and following Silas's lead with uncharacteristic docility. "Good boy," Silas found himself saying as Chester helped him carry armloads of firewood from the shed to the cabin. "We'll get through this together." The words surprised him. He hadn't used that tone of voice, warm, encouraging, protective, since Daniel was alive. It was the voice of someone who had something precious to lose, someone whose world would be diminished if harm came to the creature he was addressing. The realization should have terrified him. After 3 years of carefully maintained emotional distance, he was allowing himself to care about something that could be taken away. But somehow, Chester's steady presence made the risk feel worth taking. The donkey radiated a kind of calm competence that suggested he had no intention of being easily lost, that whatever forces had brought them together were stronger than whatever might try to separate them. By the second day of the storm, it had settled into a rhythm that felt almost cozy. Chester spent the worst hours inside the cabin itself, something Silas never would have considered allowing with any other animal, but that seemed perfectly natural with his particular companion. The donkey positioned himself near the fireplace, carefully avoiding Martha's chair, but claiming a spot where he could watch both the door and the windows while staying warm. Silas found Chester's presence in the cabin surprisingly comforting. The animal was clean and quiet, and his breathing provided a counterpoint to the wind that made the space feel less like a fortress under siege and more like a proper home. During the long hours when going outside was impossible, Silas discovered that Chester was an excellent listener for the stories that the storm seemed to shake loose from the corners of his memory. "Daniel loved storms like this," Silas said, settling into his chair while Chester dozed nearby. "Used to beg to sleep by the fire when the wind got really howling. Martha would make hot chocolate and we'd tell stories until the worst of it passed." Chester opened one eye, apparently recognizing the tone that meant a longer tale was coming. The boy had an imagination that could turn anything into an adventure. One storm must have been when he was 6 or 7. He convinced himself that the wind was actually a giant trying to blow our cabin away. Spent the whole night making fierce faces at the windows and telling the giant to pick on someone his own size. The memory brought a smile that felt natural rather than forced. Chester's presence seemed to create a safe space where Silas could remember his son without being overwhelmed by the loss. The donkey had a way of anchoring him in the present while allowing the past to flow through without drowning him. "Martha thought it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen," Silas continued. "Drew pictures of Daniel fighting the wind giant for weeks afterward. Used to say, our boy was brave enough to take on anything if he thought it was threatening his family." Chester made a soft sound that might have been sympathy or simple contentment. Either way, it encouraged Silas to continue. The storm stories led to other memories, each one easier to share than the last. Silas told Chester about Daniel's attempts to train a family of squirrels, about Martha's talent for turning the simplest meals into celebrations, about the dreams they'd all shared for the life they were building together on this mountain. For the first time in 3 years, he could speak about his lost family without feeling like each word was tearing something vital loose inside his chest. Chester listened to it all with the patience of someone who understood that these stories needed telling, that healing required the courage to remember joy as well as sorrow. On the 3rd morning, the storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived. Silas woke to brilliant sunshine, reflecting off snow so white it hurt to look at directly. The world outside the cabin had been transformed into something that belonged in a fairy tale, pine boughs bent under perfect loads of snow, icicles hanging like crystal curtains from the cabin eaves, and a silence so complete it seemed to ring in his ears. Chester was already standing by the door, apparently eager to investigate this winter wonderland. When Silas opened the cabin, the donkey stepped outside with the careful dignity of someone taking possession of territory he'd successfully defended. "We made it through," Silas said, following Chester into the transformed landscape. "First storm of the season, and we came through just fine." Chester responded by rolling enthusiastically in the fresh snow, apparently celebrating their survival in his own particular way. The sight was so unexpectedly joyful that Silas found himself laughing out loud, a sound that echoed across the crystalline silence and seemed to ring with possibilities he was just beginning to imagine. They had survived their first real test as partners, and the experience had revealed something important. They were stronger together than either of them had been alone. The realization filled Silas with a confidence he hadn't felt in years, a sense that whatever challenges winter might bring, he and Chester would meet them as a team. For the first time since Martha's death, Silas McGrath was genuinely looking forward to whatever came next. Winter settled over the mountain with the kind of relentless determination that separated survivors from dreamers. Each day brought new challenges: water lines that froze despite careful insulation, supply runs that required twice the usual effort, and the constant vigilance needed to keep both man and donkey healthy in conditions that could turn deadly without warning. But it was during these hardest weeks that Silas discovered something unexpected. He was happier than he'd been in years. The daily routine of caring for Chester, the shared work of maintaining their shelter, and the quiet companionship of long evenings by the fire had created something he'd forgotten was possible, a sense of contentment that didn't depend on avoiding painful memories, but on building new ones. Chester had adapted to mountain winter with the stoic grace of an animal who understood that survival required patience, cooperation, and the wisdom to conserve energy for when it mattered most. He spent the coldest days close to the cabin, emerging for exercise when the sun was strongest and the wind had died to manageable levels. His injured leg had healed completely, but he'd retained the habit of seeking Silas's attention for daily inspections, apparently enjoying the ritual of being fussed over. "You're becoming spoiled," Silas told him one morning as Chester presented his hoof for examination with theatrical precision. "Next you'll be wanting me to brush you down like some fancy show horse." Chester's response was to nudge Silas's pocket, where he'd taken to carrying sugar cubes salvaged from his dwindling supply of luxuries. The donkey had developed an unfortunate addiction to the treats, along with an uncanny ability to detect them, no matter how well Silas thought he'd hidden them. The sugar cubes had become part of a larger pattern of small indulgences that Silas found himself providing without conscious decision. Extra hay when Chester looked particularly content. A handful of oats as reward for good behavior. The warm mash Martha's recipe book suggested for horses in winter, adapted for donkey preferences and served in the wooden bowl. Silas had carved specifically for the purpose. These gestures of care felt natural in a way that surprised him. After 3 years of focusing solely on his own minimal needs, tending to Chester's comfort had awakened something paternal in him that he'd thought died with Daniel. The realization came gradually, emerging through accumulated moments of tenderness that felt both new and familiar. It was during one of the season's worst cold snaps that Chester fell ill. Silas woke to find the donkey standing hunched in his shelter, his breathing labored, and his usual alertness replaced by a glazed exhaustion that sent panic racing through Silas's chest. Chester's nose was hot and dry, his ears drooped with fever, and when Silas offered him water, he barely lifted his head to acknowledge the gesture. "Easy, boy," Silas murmured, running his hands along Chester's neck and feeling the heat radiating through his coat. "We'll get you through this." The words came automatically, but they carried the weight of desperate determination. The thought of losing Chester, of returning to the silence and isolation he'd only recently escaped, was unbearable in a way that caught Silas completely off guard. Somewhere in the past months, the donkey had become more than a companion. He'd become family. Silas spent the next 3 days nursing Chester with the single-minded intensity of someone who had already lost too much to accept another departure. He wrapped the donkey in Martha's old quilts, hand-fed him warm mash when he was too weak to eat on his own, and talked to him constantly in the soothing tones he'd once used with Daniel during childhood illnesses. "You're going to be fine," he told Chester, who lay on a bed of fresh hay with his head in Silas's lap. "Just need to rest and let your body fight this off. I'm not going anywhere." The vigil brought back memories. Silas had spent 3 years trying to forget sitting beside Daniel's bed during the boy's final illness, holding Martha's hand through her fevered nights, the helpless agony of watching people he loved suffer while he could do nothing but provide comfort and hope. He'd failed them both, been unable to save them despite all his love and determination. He would not fail Chester. On the second night, when Chester's fever spiked and his breathing became so shallow that Silas feared each breath might be his last, something broke open in Silas's chest that had been sealed tight since Martha's funeral. He found himself crying for the first time in 3 years, not the bitter tears of anger and regret he'd shed in the early days of grief, but something deeper and more healing. "Please don't leave me," he whispered into Chester's neck, the words carrying the weight of every loss he'd endured and every fear he'd carried since. "I need you. I need you more than I knew how to admit." Chester stirred at the sound of his voice, lifting his head just enough to nuzzle Silas's hand with weak affection. The gesture was so perfectly Chester stubborn, loving, and determined to comfort, even when he was the one who needed care, that Silas laughed through his tears. "That's my boy," he said, stroking Chester's ears with gentle fingers. "You fight, you keep fighting, and I'll take care of everything else." The fever broke on the 3rd morning. Silas woke from an exhausted doze to find Chester standing on unsteady legs, nosing at his water bucket with obvious interest. The donkey was weak and would need days to fully recover, but the glazed look was gone from his eyes, and his breathing had returned to normal. "Welcome back," Silas said, his voice rough with relief and exhaustion. Chester looked at him with an expression that seemed to acknowledge everything they'd been through together, the fear, the care, the love that had been tested and proven strong enough to sustain them both. As Chester slowly regained his strength over the following days, Silas found himself changed by the experience. The crisis had forced him to confront how much Chester meant to him, how deeply the donkey's presence had become woven into his sense of home and purpose. More importantly, it had shown him that he was capable of loving again without being destroyed by the possibility of loss. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. For 3 years, he'd protected himself by caring about nothing and no one. Chester had slowly, patiently dismantled those defenses, proving that isolation wasn't safety, but simply another form of death. "We're partners now," Silas told Chester one evening as they sat together by the fire, the donkey fully recovered and back to his usual mischievous self. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Chester responded by stealing the last of Silas's cornbread directly from his hand, apparently considering their partnership to include shared ownership of all food items. Silas didn't mind. He was discovering that love, even the love between a man and a donkey, was worth whatever it cost. Spring arrived tentatively, as it always did in the high country, with patches of snow retreating to reveal muddy earth and the first brave shoots of grass pushing through the thaw. Silas stood on his porch, watching Chester investigate these new green offerings with the methodical attention of a food critic when he spotted the rider making his way up the mountain trail. Visitors were rare enough at any time of year, but in early spring they were practically unheard of. The trail was still treacherous with mud and runoff, and most sensible people waited until summer to conduct business that required mountain travel. Silas shaded his eyes against the morning sun and tried to make out details of the approaching figure. The rider was young, probably no more than 20, and sat his horse with the careful precision of someone who'd learned that carelessness in the mountains could be fatal. He wore a leather satchel across his chest and had the pale indoor complexion of a clerk or lawyer rather than a rancher or miner. As he drew closer, Silas could see the official seal on his satchel and the nervous set of his shoulders that suggested he wasn't looking forward to whatever business had brought him to this remote cabin. Chester had noticed the visitor too and positioned himself between the stranger and Silas with the protective instincts he'd developed over the winter. The donkey's ears were forward and alert, but his posture was calm rather than aggressive. Chester had learned to read people almost as well as Silas did, and he apparently didn't sense immediate danger from this particular intruder. "Mr. McGrath," the young man called as he dismounted near the cabin. "Mr. Silas McGrath." "That's me," Silas replied, not moving from his porch. "What's your business here?" The visitor reached into his satchel with the reluctant movements of someone delivering news he knew wouldn't be welcomed. "My name is Timothy Fletcher. I'm a clerk with the Territorial Land Office in Helena. I have some documents that require your immediate attention." The formal tone and official language sent a chill through Silas that had nothing to do with the mountain air. In his experience, government documents delivered by nervous young men rarely contained good news. "What kind of documents?" he asked, stepping down from the porch with Chester close beside him. Fletcher pulled out a thick envelope, sealed with red wax, and held it towards Silas with obvious reluctance. "I'm afraid it concerns your property taxes, sir. There's been a situation." Silas took the envelope and broke the seal, his hands steady despite the growing certainty that his carefully rebuilt world was about to come crashing down around him. The legal language was dense and filled with the kind of bureaucratic terminology designed to obscure rather than clarify. But the essential facts were clear enough to make his blood run cold. His property had been sold at auction for unpaid taxes. The sale had been conducted in accordance with territorial law, with proper notice published in the Helena newspaper and posted at the territorial courthouse. The new owner, identified as the Rocky Mountain Mining and Development Company, had full legal title to all 40 acres of his land, including his cabin, outbuildings, and any improvements he'd made over the past 30 years. He had 30 days to vacate the premises. "This has to be a mistake," Silas said, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "I paid my taxes. I've always paid my taxes." Fletcher shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. "According to our records, sir, you're 3 years behind on your payments. The total amount owed, including penalties and interest, comes to $467. 3 years? Silas's mind raced back through the fog of grief that had clouded the period after Martha's death. He remembered paying bills, remembered the careful budgeting that mountain life required, but the specific details were lost in the haze of survival that had characterized those dark months. "I paid what I owed. I'm certain of it. The records show no payments received since 1882, sir. The property was legally advertised for sale, and when no one came forward to settle the debt, it was auctioned to satisfy the tax lien." Chester pressed closer to Silas's side, apparently sensing his distress. The donkey's warmth was comforting, but it couldn't change the reality of the legal document in Silas's hands, or the fact that everything he'd built, everything he and Chester had shared, was about to be torn away. "Who bid on it?" Silas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Fletcher consulted another document from his satchel. The successful bidder was Rocky Mountain Mining and Development Company. They acquired the property for the minimum bid of $500. The name meant nothing to Silas, but the nature of the business told him everything he needed to know. Mining companies didn't buy mountain property for scenic views or hunting cabins. They bought it to strip away everything valuable and leave behind scarred earth and poisoned water. "What do they want with my land?" he asked. "I'm not privy to their specific plans, sir. My job is simply to deliver the legal notice and ensure you understand your obligations under territorial law." But even as Fletcher spoke, Silas was beginning to understand more than the young clerk realized. 3 years of unpaid taxes, despite his certainty that he'd met his obligations. A mining company ready with the exact minimum bid necessary to acquire the property. An auction conducted with notices published in Helena rather than Pine Ridge, ensuring that anyone who might have warned him would never see them. This wasn't bureaucratic incompetence or simple oversight. This was a carefully orchestrated plan to steal his land, and he had a growing suspicion about who had orchestrated it. "The Citizens' Committee," he said aloud, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Fletcher looked confused. "I'm sorry, sir?" But Silas was no longer talking to the clerk. He was thinking about Mayor Caldwell and his cronies, about their repeated offers to buy his property over the past 2 years, about their increasing hostility when he'd refused to sell. They'd tried legitimate means first, offering prices that grew higher with each rejection. When that failed, they'd apparently decided to take what they couldn't buy. The donkey had been part of it too, he realized. Not the kindly joke he'd convinced himself it was, but another piece of their campaign to paint him as the crazy hermit who didn't deserve to keep his land. Send him a worthless animal, let the town laugh about the two outcasts keeping each other company up on the mountain, use his supposed eccentricity as further evidence that he was unfit to be a landowner. Except their plan had backfired in the most fundamental way possible. Chester hadn't driven Silas deeper into isolation and madness. He'd brought him back to life, given him something to fight for beyond mere survival. "I want to see the tax records," Silas said, his voice carrying a new edge of determination. "All of them. Every payment I made, every notice that was supposedly sent." Fletcher looked even more uncomfortable. "That would require a formal request through the territorial office, sir. There are procedures, then I'll follow the procedures. But I'm telling you right now, something's not right about this. I paid my taxes, and if your records show otherwise, then someone's been tampering with them." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Fletcher was young, but he wasn't stupid. He could hear the implications in Silas's words, could see the possibility that he'd been used as an unwitting tool in someone else's scheme. "I understand your concerns, Mr. McGrath," he said carefully, "but the law is the law. You have 30 days to vacate, regardless of any irregularities in the records. If you want to challenge the sale, you'll need to file an appeal with the territorial court." Silas folded the legal documents and slipped them into his jacket pocket. 30 days. 30 days to save everything he and Chester had built together, everything that had brought meaning back to his life. "I'll be filing that appeal," he said. "And I'll be looking into exactly how Rocky Mountain Mining and Development Company knew to bid on property that wasn't supposed to be for sale." Fletcher mounted his horse with obvious relief, apparently eager to escape before the situation became more complicated. "Good luck, sir. I hope you're able to resolve this to your satisfaction." As the young clerk rode back down the mountain, Silas stood in his yard with Chester beside him, looking at the cabin and outbuildings that might not be his much longer. The donkey seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed, something that threatened the life they'd built together. "Well, boy," Silas said, running his hand along Chester's neck. "Looks like we've got a fight on our hands." Chester's response was to plant himself more firmly beside Silas, apparently ready for whatever battle lay ahead. For the first time in 3 years, Silas McGrath had something worth fighting for. The question was whether 30 days would be enough time to save it. The ride down to Pine Ridge took longer than usual because Silas refused to leave Chester behind. The donkey had become more than a companion over the winter months. He was a partner, a witness to Silas's transformation, and perhaps most importantly, living proof that the townspeople's cruel joke had backfired in ways they never could have anticipated. Chester seemed to understand the gravity of their mission. He walked with unusual solemnity beside Silas's horse, his ears alert and his pace steady despite the muddy spring conditions that made travel treacherous. Occasionally he would look up at Silas as if checking that his human was holding up under the pressure of their circumstances. The legal documents tucked inside Silas's jacket pocket felt heavier than their actual weight, carrying as they did the power to destroy everything he'd rebuilt over the past months. But alongside the fear and anger Silas discovered something he hadn't felt in years, a fighting spirit that had been dormant since Martha's death but was now awakening with fierce determination. He'd spent the previous evening going through every scrap of paper he could find, searching for evidence of his tax payments. What he'd discovered was troubling. He had clear records of payments made in 1880 and 1881, but the receipts from 1882 onward were missing. He remembered making those payments, remembered the careful budgeting required to scrape together the money during the difficult period after Martha's death. But the physical proof was gone. Someone had been in his cabin. Someone had taken the documents that would have protected his property rights. The violation felt almost as personal as the theft itself. The knowledge that while he'd been drowning in grief, people he'd considered neighbors, if not friends, had been plotting to steal his home. Chester snorted and tossed his head, apparently sharing Silas's indignation. "That's right, boy," Silas murmured. "We're going to show them what happens when you underestimate a man who's got something to fight for." The first stop was the territorial office branch that occupied a cramped room above the general store. The clerk there, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Pemberton, greeted Silas with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she'd been expecting him. "Mr. McGrath," she said, looking up from her ledger books, "I understand you have questions about your tax assessment." "I have questions about my missing payments," Silas replied, placing the legal documents on her desk. "According to this notice, I haven't paid taxes in 3 years. According to my memory and what records I still have, that's a lie." Mrs. Pemberton opened a thick ledger and ran her finger down columns of names and numbers. "I show no payments recorded under your name since 1881, Mr. McGrath. If you made payments after that date, you should have receipts." "My receipts are missing. Stolen, most likely." The accusation hung in the air like an accusation of murder. Mrs. Pemberton's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something approaching concern. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. McGrath. Are you saying someone broke into your home?" "I'm saying someone wanted my land badly enough to make sure I couldn't prove I'd paid what I owed. The question is whether this office was part of the scheme or just careless about keeping accurate records." Mrs. Pemberton bristled at the implied criticism. "Our records are meticulous, sir. Every payment is logged and verified. If you made payments, there would be documentation. Then I want to see the original tax assessments, the ones that show how much I owed each year, when the bills were sent, and where they were delivered." The ledger entries told a disturbing story. The tax assessments for 1882 and 1883 had been sent to an address in Pine Ridge rather than to Silas's mountain cabin. The amounts owed had been calculated using an assessment that valued his property at nearly twice what it had been worth in previous years. Most damning of all, the final notices before the auction had been sent to the same Pine Ridge address, ensuring that Silas would never receive them. "This isn't my address," Silas said, pointing to the entries. "I've never lived in town. Every notice for 30 years has been delivered to my cabin." Mrs. Pemberton studied the entries with growing unease. The address changes were authorized by Mayor Caldwell. He submitted a form stating that you'd requested all correspondence be sent to his office for your convenience. "I never made any such request." The evidence was circumstantial but damning. Someone with access to official forms and the authority to make changes to tax records had systematically ensured that Silas would miss his payments and lose his property to auction. The same someone had made sure a mining company was ready to purchase the land at the minimum possible price. "I want copies of everything," Silas said. "Every form, every assessment, every change to my records. And I want to know exactly who had access to make those changes." Mrs. Pemberton was already reaching for her filing cabinet, apparently recognizing that she was looking at evidence of corruption that could destroy careers and possibly land people in prison. "I'll need to consult with my supervisor," she said. This is highly irregular. Irregular is one word for it. Criminal is another. While Mrs. Pemberton compiled documents, Silas and Chester made their way to the mayor's office. The building that housed Pine Ridge's municipal government was barely more than a large shed, but Mayor Caldwell had decorated his portion with enough official seals and certificates to suggest he took his authority seriously. Caldwell was a soft man in his 50s who'd built his political career on the promise of bringing progress and prosperity to Pine Ridge. He greeted Silas with the kind of forced friendliness that suggested he'd been expecting this confrontation. "Silas, good to see you in town. I trust you received the legal documents from the territorial office?" "I received them, along with some interesting information about how my tax records were handled." Caldwell's smile flickered, but didn't disappear entirely. "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation for any irregularities. Bureaucracy can be complicated, especially for someone who doesn't deal with it regularly. Someone changed my mailing address without my permission. Someone made sure I never received the tax bills or the auction notices. Someone who had authority to make official changes to territorial records. That's a serious accusation, Silas. I hope you have evidence to support it." Silas pulled out the copies Mrs. Pemberton had provided. "Your signature is on the authorization form. You want to tell me why you thought you had the right to redirect my mail?" Caldwell's expression shifted from false friendliness to something harder and more calculating. "You were in no condition to handle business matters after your wife's death. I was trying to help by making sure important documents didn't get lost in your grief. By making sure I never saw them at all. By making sure they were handled by someone competent to deal with them. You've become a hermit up there, Silas. Half the town thinks you've lost your mind completely." The mask was slipping now, revealing the contempt that had always lurked beneath Caldwell's political courtesy. "You're not fit to own that much land. You don't use it productively, you don't contribute to the community, and you're sitting on resources that could benefit everyone in Pine Ridge." Resources like what? Caldwell realized he'd said too much, but there was no taking it back now. Mineral rights, timber rights, land that could support real development instead of one crazy old man talking to animals. "So you decided to steal it. I decided to make sure it went to people who could use it properly. Rocky Mountain Mining will bring jobs to this area, real prosperity instead of your selfish isolation." Chester had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, apparently understanding more of the conversation than anyone might have expected from a donkey. When Caldwell raised his voice, Chester responded by planting himself firmly between the mayor and Silas, radiating protective menace despite his diminutive size. "Even your animal knows you don't belong here," Caldwell sneered. "You want to fight this? Go ahead. You've got 30 days and no money for lawyers. Rocky Mountain Mining has already started planning their operation." "We'll see about that," Silas said, gathering his documents. "We'll just see about that." As they left the mayor's office, Silas felt the weight of the challenge ahead. 30 days to prove corruption, find a lawyer, and somehow overturn a legal sale that had already been completed. It should have been impossible. But as Chester fell into step beside him, radiating loyal determination, Silas realized he was no longer the broken, isolated man who might have simply accepted defeat. He had something worth fighting for now, and he had a partner who believed in him. The battle for their home was just beginning, but for the first time since receiving those legal documents, Silas believed they might actually have a chance to win. The question was whether the people of Pine Ridge were ready for the fight that was coming their way. The territorial courthouse in Helena was an imposing stone building that seemed designed to remind ordinary citizens of their proper place in the grand scheme of justice. Silas had never been inside before, and as he climbed the marble steps with Chester waiting patiently outside, he felt the weight of every year he'd spent avoiding civilization and the complications that came with it. The hearing room was smaller than he'd expected, paneled in dark wood that absorbed light and sound with funeral solemnity. Judge Morrison presided from behind an elevated bench that made him look like a stern grandfather passing judgment on wayward children. The Rocky Mountain Mining Company was represented by 3 lawyers in expensive suits who carried themselves with the confidence of men accustomed to getting their way. Silas had managed to find legal representation in the form of Andrew Fairchild, a young lawyer fresh from Territorial Law School who'd taken the case more for the experience than the modest fee Silas could afford to pay. Fairchild was earnest and well prepared, but Silas could see the nervousness in the way he shuffled his papers and adjusted his collar. "Your Honor," began the lead mining company lawyer, a silver-haired man named Bradford, who spoke with the polished authority of someone who'd never lost a case he cared about winning. "This is a simple matter of territorial law. The property in question was legally sold at public auction to satisfy outstanding tax debts. My client purchased the land in good faith, following all prescribed legal procedures." Bradford's presentation was masterful in its simplicity. He produced documentation showing the tax assessments, the published notices of sale, and the auction records. Everything appeared proper and legal on its surface, which was exactly what made the corruption underneath so difficult to prove. Mr. McGrath failed to pay his property taxes for 3 consecutive years, Bradford continued. Despite proper notice and multiple opportunities to settle his debt, he chose to ignore his legal obligations. The territory cannot allow property owners to simply abandon their responsibilities without consequence. When Bradford finished, Judge Morrison turned to Fairchild with the patient expression of someone waiting to be convinced that this wasn't a waste of the court's time. "Your Honor," Fairchild began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, "what Mr. Bradford has presented appears legal on its surface, but the evidence we've uncovered suggests a systematic conspiracy to defraud my client of his rightful property." Fairchild's presentation was more detailed but less polished than Bradford's. He walked the judge through the evidence. Silas had gathered the redirected mail, the inflated property assessments, the convenient timing of the mining company's bid. But each piece of evidence was circumstantial, suggestive rather than conclusive. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Fairchild continued, "we have testimony from Mrs. Pemberton at the territorial office that the address changes were made without my client's knowledge or consent, using forged authorization forms bearing Mayor Caldwell's signature. This was their strongest evidence," and Silas watched. Judge Morrison's expression carefully for any sign that it was making an impression. The judge was taking notes, asking pointed questions about dates and procedures, but his face remained professionally neutral. Bradford rose for his rebuttal with the languid confidence of a cat approaching a cornered mouse. "Your Honor, my learned colleague is asking this court to overturn a legal sale based on speculation and conspiracy theories. Even if we accept his allegations about mailing addresses, which we do not, the fact remains that Mr. McGrath had 3 years to discover and correct any administrative errors. His failure to do so cannot be blamed on anyone but himself." The legal arguments continued for another hour, each side presenting their interpretation of territorial law and precedent. But Silas found his attention drifting to the window, where he could see Chester waiting in the courthouse yard. The donkey was surrounded by a small crowd of curious onlookers, including several children who were apparently fascinated by his calm dignity in the midst of the busy town square. The sight reminded Silas that this legal battle was about more than property rights or corruption. It was about the right to choose your own way of living, to find peace and purpose in places and relationships that others might not understand. Chester represented everything good that had come from the townspeople's attempt to humiliate him, the unexpected friendship that had saved his life and given him reason to hope again. "Your Honor," Silas said suddenly, rising from his seat despite Fairchild's restraining hand on his arm. "May I address the court?" Judge Morrison looked surprised but nodded his permission. "You may speak, Mr. McGrath, but please keep your remarks relevant to the legal issues before us." Silas walked to the center of the room, feeling every eye in the courtroom focused on him. He'd spent 3 years avoiding exactly this kind of attention, but Chester's presence outside gave him the courage to speak truths he'd never expected to share with strangers. "Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't understand all the legal complexities being discussed here. But I understand right and wrong, and I understand what it means to have something worth fighting for." Bradford started to object, but Judge Morrison silenced him with a raised hand. "3 years ago, I lost my wife to fever," Silas continued. "Lost my boy 15 years before that to the same disease. I thought I'd lost everything worth living for, but thought the best I could do was survive until it was my turn to join them." The courtroom had grown completely quiet, even the lawyers putting down their pens to listen. "Then the people of Pine Ridge sent me a donkey as a joke. Called him my perfect match, figured two worthless creatures deserved each other. But that donkey Chester, he taught me something I'd forgotten. He taught me that healing is possible, that friendship can bloom in the Compton, the most unlikely places, and that home isn't just land and buildings. It's the place where someone cares whether you live or die." Silas paused, gathering his thoughts and his courage for what he needed to say next. What's happening here isn't just about tax law or property rights. It's about whether a man has the right to choose his own path to healing, his own way of finding purpose. Mayor Caldwell and his friends decided I didn't deserve that choice. They decided my land was more valuable than my life. The words hung in the air like a challenge, demanding that everyone present consider not just the legal technicalities, but the human cost of the decisions being made. Judge Morrison studied Silas with the kind of careful attention that suggested he was seeing more than just another property dispute. "Mr. McGrath, while your personal circumstances are certainly compelling, this court must base its decisions on legal evidence rather than emotional appeals. Do you have anything concrete to add to your attorney's presentation?" Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather journal, worn smooth by years of handling. "Your Honor, this belonged to my son Daniel. He died when he was 8 years old, but he kept a diary of his dreams and hopes. One of the things he wrote about was wanting a pet specifically. He drew pictures of donkeys and horses and wrote about how much he wanted a friend who would never leave him." Bradford rose to object, but Judge Morrison held up his hand for silence, apparently curious about where this was leading. "I found this journal while I was organizing my belongings after Chester arrived," Silas continued. "It reminded me that my son would have loved that donkey, would have seen him as exactly the kind of friend he'd always dreamed of having. The people who sent Chester to me thought they were being cruel, but they gave me something my boy would have treasured." Silas opened the journal to a page marked with pressed wildflowers. Daniel wrote, "Papa says animals know when you need them most. Maybe someday I'll find one who needs me too. That's what Chester and I found. We both needed someone who understood what it meant to be unwanted." The courtroom was absolutely silent now, even the stenographer having stopped her transcription to listen. "Your Honor," Silas said, closing the journal and looking directly at Judge Morrison, "if you rule against me today, you're not just taking away my land. You're taking away the place where my son is buried, where my wife's garden still grows wild, and where I finally learned that healing is possible even after the worst losses imaginable." Judge Morrison was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from Silas to the legal documents spread across his bench, then to the window where Chester could still be seen, waiting patiently in the courthouse yard. "Mr. Bradford," the judge said finally, "I want to review your client's purchase documentation one more time. Specifically, I want to understand how Rocky Mountain Mining Company knew to bid on this particular property." Bradford's confidence flickered for the first time during the proceedings. "Your Honor, public auctions are advertised according to territorial law. Any interested party has the right to participate in the bidding process. But your client bid exactly the minimum amount required," Judge Morrison noted. "No competing bids, no market rate valuation, just the precise sum needed to satisfy the tax debt. That suggests either remarkable coincidence or prior knowledge of the situation." The judge was clearly thinking through the implications of everything he'd heard. Silas held his breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine not just his future, but Chester's as well. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, the evidence presented regarding mailing address changes and inflated property assessments suggests systematic manipulation of the tax collection process. Even if each individual action could be explained away, the pattern is deeply troubling. Bradford attempted one final argument. Your Honor, even accepting my colleague's conspiracy theories, the law requires property owners to ensure their tax obligations are met. Mr. McGrath's ignorance of his situation cannot invalidate a legal sale. Mr. Bradford, Judge Morrison said, his tone carrying a new edge of authority, ignorance is one thing. Deliberate deception by public officials is quite another. The evidence suggests that Mr. McGrath was systematically prevented from meeting his obligations through fraud and corruption. The judge gathered his papers and stood, commanding the attention of everyone in the courtroom. This court finds that the tax sale of Mr. McGrath's property was conducted under fraudulent circumstances. The evidence of manipulated mailing addresses, inflated assessments, and coordinated timing with the mining company's bid constitutes clear proof of conspiracy to defraud. Silas felt his knees go weak with relief, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Therefore, this court hereby invalidates the sale to Rocky Mountain Mining Company and orders the immediate restoration of clear title to Mr. Silas McGrath. Furthermore, I am directing the Territorial Attorney General to investigate the conduct of Mayor Caldwell and any other officials involved in this scheme. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of celebration and outrage. Bradford and his colleagues were already gathering their papers, clearly preparing appeals and damage control. Fairchild was grinning like a man who just won his first major case, which he had. But Silas was focused on the window, where Chester had somehow managed to position himself so he could see into the courtroom. The donkey's ears were pricked forward with obvious interest, as if he understood that something important had just happened. Mr. McGrath, Judge Morrison said as the commotion began, to settle. You're free to return to your property, and I hope you and your companion find the peace there that you've fought so hard to preserve. As Silas made his way through the crowd of well-wishers and curious onlookers, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The legal battle was over, but more importantly, he and Chester could go home. Outside, Chester greeted him with a gentle nuzzle and what could only be described as a satisfied expression. Somehow, the donkey had known they would win. "Come on, boy," Silas said, running his hand along Chester's neck. "Let's go home." For the first time in 30 days, those words meant exactly what they should. A place where they belonged, where they were wanted, and where their unlikely friendship could continue to flourish in the Montana wilderness they both loved. Spring had fully claimed the mountain by the time Silas and Chester returned home from Helena. The snow had retreated to the highest peaks. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant displays of color, and the air carried the sweet scent of pine needles warming in the sunshine. But the most significant change wasn't in the landscape, it was in the steady stream of visitors making their way up the mountain trail to Silas McGrath's cabin. The first to arrive was Mrs. Pemberton from the Territorial Office, bringing official documents confirming Silas's restored property rights and a personal apology for her unwitting role in the conspiracy. She stayed for coffee and cornbread, listening with obvious pleasure as Silas told her about Chester's remarkable intelligence and gentle nature. "I never had much use for donkeys before," she admitted, watching Chester methodically organize a pile of pine cones according to some mysterious donkey logic. "But this one has genuine character. You can see it in his eyes." Chester responded to the compliment by presenting her with his finest pine cone, apparently accepting her into the small circle of humans he deemed worthy of respect. The visits became a regular occurrence. People from Pine Ridge made the journey with increasing frequency, some bringing gifts of food or supplies, others simply curious about the hermit and his donkey who had defeated the powerful mining interests. Children were especially drawn to Chester, who seemed to understand that small humans required extra patience and gentleness. Young Tommy Walsh, the boy Silas had once growled at in town, became a particular favorite. The child would sit for hours telling Chester elaborate stories about knights and dragons, while the donkey listened with the kind of focused attention that suggested he found the tales genuinely entertaining. "Chester's the best listener in the whole territory," Tommy announced during one visit. "Better than grown-ups, because he doesn't interrupt or tell you to get to the point." Silas found himself agreeing. Chester had taught him the value of patient listening, of being present for someone else's joys and sorrows without feeling compelled to offer solutions or judgments. The chicken coop project was finally completed, with help from several townspeople who volunteered their labor as a gesture of apology for their previous treatment. Chester supervised the construction with obvious satisfaction, occasionally offering suggestions through strategic positioning of building materials or pointed looks at workmanship he deemed substandard. When the first chickens arrived, a gift from the Henderson family, Chester appointed himself their guardian and protector. He would patrol the coop area each morning and evening, ensuring that no predators threatened his charges and that the hens had everything they needed for productive egg-laying. "Never seen a donkey take such interest in poultry," commented Mr. Henderson, watching Chester conduct his daily inspection. "It's like he considers himself responsible for their welfare." "He takes responsibility seriously," Silas replied. "Always has, since the day he arrived." The new cabin sign had been carved during the long winter evenings, but Silas waited until spring to install it properly. The sign read, "McGrath and Chester welcome," in letters deep enough to last for decades. As he hung it beside the front door, Chester positioned himself underneath, as if posing for an official photograph. "There," Silas said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Now everyone knows this is our place." Chester's response was to roll enthusiastically in the fresh grass, apparently celebrating their official partnership with characteristic donkey exuberance. The journal entries began as a practical matter, recording daily activities, weather patterns, and Chester's ongoing adventures. But as spring progressed into summer, they evolved into something more personal. Silas found himself writing about the small miracles of daily life with Chester, the way laughter had returned to his cabin, and the unexpected joy of having someone to care for again. "Martha would have loved him," he wrote one evening as Chester dozed by the fireplace. "She always said the best relationships were built on mutual stubbornness and shared understanding of what really matters." Chester and I certainly qualify on both counts. The memories of Martha and Daniel had become gentler over the months, less like open wounds and more like treasured photographs that could be taken out and examined without causing unbearable pain. Chester's presence had created a safe space where love could exist without the constant fear of loss, where the past could coexist peacefully with an uncertain but hopeful future. Mayor Caldwell had been removed from office and faced criminal charges for his role in the land fraud scheme. Rocky Mountain Mining Company had quietly abandoned their plans for the area and moved their operations elsewhere. The Citizens Committee had disbanded in disgrace, replaced by a new town council that seemed more interested in genuine community building than in scheming against eccentric neighbors. But perhaps the most significant change was in Silas himself. The man who had once crossed streets to avoid conversation now looked forward to visitors and found genuine pleasure in sharing stories about life on the mountain. Chester had somehow transformed him from a grieving hermit into someone who understood that healing required both solitude and connection, both independence and community. As autumn approached and the first hints of winter appeared in the changing light, Silas stood on his porch, watching Chester investigate a fascinating cluster of fallen leaves. The donkey's coat was thick and glossy, his eyes bright with contentment, and his manner radiating the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. "Ready for another winter, boy?" Silas asked. Chester looked up from his leaf investigation and fixed Silas with a look that clearly conveyed his opinion. Bring on whatever weather and challenges the mountain could muster. They had each other, they had their home, and they had learned that the most unlikely friendships often proved to be the strongest. The sun was setting behind the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that would have taken Martha's breath away. Silas settled into his chair with a cup of coffee. Chester dozed contentedly nearby, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called to its mate across the vast Montana wilderness. For the first time in years, Silas McGrath was exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly the companion he needed. The joke the townspeople had intended as cruelty had become the greatest gift of his life, a reminder that love could bloom in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the things we don't ask for are precisely what we need most. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to discover what was possible when two stubborn souls decided to face the world together. But tonight, as the mountains settled into peaceful darkness, Silas and Chester were simply home.